thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Jason Cervenek. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator for the Byrd Polar Research Center, and I'd like to thank the Conservatory for hosting us this evening. Just to let everybody in the audience know, there is also a live call that we're broadcasting tonight, so the event is broadcast and then is available for viewing later. We're not doing any video work, just audio, and all the slides are available. So that'll be anybody can see that anytime in the future that they'd like. So I'd like to welcome you here this evening. Joel Barker from the School of Earth Sciences at Ohio State is here tonight, and he'll be presenting. He's also a researcher at the Byrd Polar Research Center, Marion Branch campus. And Joel has been gracious enough to make a number of presentations to school groups, educators, community members over the last year and a half. So thanks for joining us again. And he probably has one of the most amazing things to show you that I think the center has, which is kind of a well-kept secret. So you'll get a chance to see some ancient material this evening. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks very much, Jason, and thank you all for coming to the talk tonight. It's a wonderful venue, and I hope the talk lives up to the venue anyway. So I'm going to be talking about 3 million-year-old polar plants, evidence of a boreal forest ecosystem in the Canadian high Arctic. I chose this slide as the title slide, and it seems not to the talk at all, right? There are no plants. And that's the environment there now. There are plants. There's not plants like there used to be. And so I'm going to be presenting some data from work that I've done a couple years back, showing how we can use this evidence to give us insight into how things used to be in the Arctic and how things might be in the future. Area here, Columbus, and we'll go all the way up to about 82 degrees north on northern Ellesmere Island. A long one up there beside Greenland. A satellite view shows a better defined image of the area we're going to be looking at. It's actually a national park in Canada. From about here northwards, there's also a military base just on the northern tip. It's probably best known for this long lake called Lake Hazen. It's the largest freshwater body north of the Arctic Circle. It's about 74 kilometers long, 3 kilometers wide, and upwards of 250 meters deep. And because it's such a huge freshwater body, it actually modulates climate latitude area. So it's the terminating ground for migratory birds, richly diverse in animal and bird life. If you look at this picture as well, you can see this area here is quite dry. There's not a lot of snow there, as opposed to on the other side of this chain of mountains, there is a lot of snow. And that's because these mountains, the Grantland Mountains, serve as sort of a weather trap for systems coming off the Byrd Sea. They raise over these mountains, precipitation falls to the west, and on the east side it's quite dry. So it's a polar desert environment. Temperatures, because of the lake, are, as I said, quite mild. These are summertime temperatures, so from May to August, this was in 2009, but it really doesn't change that much. Your average is about 4-5 degrees Celsius. In July, though, it gets upwards of 10 degrees, some excursions up into the 20s. So it's a very short growing season, short warm season, but quite significant. This is what it looks like on the ground. So as is typical for polar desert, there's sparsely vegetated, mostly just mineral soils, permafrost soils, so they're frozen year-round, except in west sort of weedy vegetation. And if you take a step backwards, Grantland Mountains spanning to the north, and again, very sort of unvegetated area, except for in the low-lying areas where water can collect, you get your wetland, where it can be lushly vegetated. Of the plants you see there, dominated by things like dwarf fireweed, that is mountain avens, Arctic poppy, and this is the only tree you see up there, this dwarf willow. It tends to grow to a maximum of a centimeter or 2 off the ground, but spreads out quite extensively laterally. And that's an adaptation so that they don't suffer from a lot of wind damage or desiccation due to snowfall, so that tends to protect them. But in terms of trees, that's all you get up there. this white line indicates tree line. You can see just how much farther north we are than tree line in North America. So you wouldn't expect to find trees there at all. Now, before we get too deeply into this, I want to make a distinction, some terminology we'll have to remember. So most people have heard of petrified wood. Degree, show of hands, petrified wood. All right, so this is wood where slow groundwater movement, water that's rich in silica, has either encased or replaced all of the organic matter inside the wood. Whereas mummified, just like you'd think with Egyptian mummies, here we just desiccated something. Okay? So I have a piece actually of mummified wood here. Now, it's a bit dirty, so try not to get all over yourselves, but it's just like wood we'd find outside today. Okay? There's nothing really amazing about it, except for the fact that you find it up here where there are no trees. But it's in a mummified state. It's not petrified. There's been no mineral replacement. So this allows us to use many of the techniques that people use for contemporary trees on this material. So I was up there on a totally unrelated project, and I'll cover some of the results later in the talk. What we were looking at was net ecosystem restoration. That probably doesn't make any sense to you now. I'll get to it in a bit. But because we're in a national park, the park wardens, who are normally stationed farther south, they all go up there in the summertime because that's where they want to be, and camp in the park. So around dinner one night, we were talking about things. He asked what we were doing. He said, "Do you know anything about trees?" Well, not really. He says, "Because we found some up here." And he showed me this picture. This is a muskox print for scale. So these are sizable pieces of wood. These are logs. Like nothing there is up there now. So how did they get there? What are they? I was immediately interested, so got in a helicopter, flew to this site, got off the helicopter. The pilot told us we had 30 minutes, and so we just ran around like crazy trying to grab samples. But grabbed enough samples that we could actually sort of try to figure out what was there and why it was worth going back. And so we did go back. This is sort of typical of what you'd see on the site, just wood scattered around. Some really interesting things about this wood. First of all, that's a piece of spruce, and that's not someone's giant finger. That's just your average-sized person's finger. You can see they're very narrow trees, but that tree is at least 87 years old based on counting the tree rings in it. So any trees that lived up there didn't put a lot of resources into actually putting on biomass. They were just sort of hanging on, just surviving, which has some interesting implications, which I'll get into in a little bit. In full disclosure, this isn't the only place in the Canadian Arctic where you find trees above tree line. This is a list of sites where trees have been reported. Most of them sort of span in the last 5 to 10 million years, how old these pieces of wood are. The oldest is 45 million years old, that Metasequoia site, denoted by the letter N. So people get this wood, they go and determine the age of this wood, and those are the results they come up with. It's exceedingly difficult to do that, and I'll get into that a bit later on as well. What makes our site unique isn't really the age of it, because I'll tell you how we get into the age a bit later. I'm sending out all these teasers, and I apologize for that. We'll get into it a bit later. But the age isn't what makes this site special, in my opinion. It's the fact that we're the farthest north. That BR that's close to us, that's actually got a lot of petrified wood. They're not in a mummified state, so that limits the analysis we can do. It's far north, and there's evidence that the plants were very much under stress in that region because those tree rings are so small. So the idea here is that if we've got vegetation at this latitude indicating a past climate during the Pliocene, if climate was about to change in the Arctic, ours, I would argue, and I have argued unsuccessfully to funding agency, ours would be the first site to indicate a biotic response to that climate change, because the plants are just on the edge of their survival. Any perturbation, they're going to be most sensitive to. More sensitive than sites farther south where they're somewhat insulated from climate change because they're in a more moderate climate. So now we get into some graphs that I take from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the fourth assessment in 2007, basically showing that climate change on our planet is nothing new. Okay, we have had times in the past where climate has been warmer, it's been colder. So if you look up on the very top graph there, we've got atmospheric carbon dioxide on the one graph, or on the one axis, we've got time across the top there, and we've got continental glaciation, the paleolatitude. And all that's telling us is that's the latitude to which ice extended during that ice age, as indicated by those blue bars coming down from the top. And then the atmospheric CO2 corresponds to the rest of the squiggly lines there. And there's multiple avenues of investigation you can go into when you're discussing these sort of things and trying to find evidence of climate change. So you can look at things like boron isotopes. Now this is a tricky one because boron isotopes don't tell you anything about carbon dioxide directly. What boron tells you is how acidic the water body was that you sampled. So in this case, seawater. Now how does that relate? Well, if we've got a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, it mixes with water to form an acid, carbonic acid, and that acidifies the ocean, something that's been in the press recently, ocean acidification, that sort of thing. So that happened in the past when CO2 levels were high in the atmosphere. And you can tease out that signal using things like boron isotopes. Things like the stomata as well. Plants have an inverse relationship with the density of stomates that they put in their leaves and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So the more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the less stomates will show up in their leaves. So you can look at fossils, get an abundance of stomates, and get an idea of how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere. But notice in none of these we're explicitly measuring temperature. We're just measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay? But as we've been told, and as we've learned, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It can be a climate forcer. So does that add up? Well, we go to this graph, this middle one, to see if that adds up. And you can see on this axis we have deep ocean temperature in degrees Celsius. On this axis we have delta 18O in per mil. That's just an isotope of oxygen that you can use to actually get temperature of water. And you can see that when we've got atmospheric CO2, both in that top graph and then blown up over this more narrow period of time, going from 0 to 65 million years ago, you can see the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere roughly correlate to temperature. So there seems to be some sort of causality in the past, or some sort of correlation in the past. And of course, causality has been proven in recently. So we're applying these recent ideas about greenhouse gases to the past, looking for indicators that that relationship held in the past as well, and it does. So one thing I'd like to point out here, again, getting back to the point that climate has always changed in Earth's past. So you can look at this high point here, where we've had deep ocean temperature upwards of 12 degrees. This is known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Okay? That's when Earth's temperatures rose 6 degrees, and it took 2,000 years for it to do that. And so you might ask why. How did we do that? When we're talking about climate change in the future on our planet, we're talking about a change of 3 degrees in the next century, which is incredibly rapid relative to the PETM. Presently we attribute CO2 in the atmosphere to anthropogenic sources, fossil fuel burning. What happened in the past? We're seeing the same sort of trend. What's the explanation for this sort of rise back then? And the answer is this is when Pangaea, that supercontinent, when Africa was our next door neighbor, all the continents on the planet were condensed into one supercontinent named Pangaea. Well, it started breaking up due to plate tectonics. So there was widespread rifting, lots of volcanism, lots of CO2 being emitted to the atmosphere, methane as well. And so we did have a CO2 and methane-enriched atmosphere during this time, and we had the highest temperatures that we've seen in the last 65 million years. Okay. You can also see we have dips in temperature, and these correspond to ice ages. Okay, you can see these blue lines up here. With this first dip, this is when the East Antarctic ice sheet started to grow. We start getting, some threshold is reached at this side where we start getting the West Antarctic ice sheet growing. And then finally at around 2.5 million years ago, that's when we start getting ice sheets in Greenland and pervasive sea ice in the Canadian Arctic. So it's within this context that we're trying to fit these logs, these pieces of wood that no longer exist. How did they live up there, way above tree line? How did they get there? How did they live there? How did they survive? And what can they tell us about climate? So everyone's heard of the greenhouse effect. It's actually, it's an amazing thing, the greenhouse effect, because it's been here forever, and that's why Earth is such a good place to live. But as a climate scientist, I like the greenhouse effect because you can see the greenhouse effect. This is a sideways shot from the International Space Station through our Earth's atmosphere. So this is the land surface here, and then we've got this red band, and then this blue band. So this is Earth's atmosphere. And the reason why this is red, that's the troposphere. That's where all the greenhouse gases are. That's where all the water vapor is. Okay? So this is where sunlight is being scattered due to greenhouse gas composition. Above that, we don't have greenhouse gases. We have ozone, which interacts with shortwave radiation coming in from the sun. But this, in a picture, is the greenhouse effect. This, in a diagram, is the greenhouse effect. Sun, incoming solar radiation comes in across broad wavelengths, shortwave radiation. Some of it makes it to the Earth's surface, heats up the Earth's surface. The Earth re-radiates this radiation as longer wave radiation, and it's this long wave radiation that interacts with greenhouse gases, things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and others, water vapor, traps that infrared radiation from escaping back out into space, causing warming in the troposphere, where all these are found, and that's the greenhouse effect. So by adding more greenhouse gases to the troposphere, we're thickening that blanket, as it were, and increasing the retention of long-wave radiation back into space and heating our planet. This is a diagram taken from NASA and the National Oceanographic Administration. Up in the top corner there, we've got concentrations of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and a bunch of nasty CFCs and things like that, just showing that the concentration of all of these things has increased over time and continues to increase today. Here is the temperature in the lower stratosphere, which is the atmospheric layer that's above the troposphere, where all the greenhouse gases are. So if we're looking for greenhouse gas warming, we expect the troposphere to heat, whereas the stratosphere should actually cool if it does anything, if the greenhouse effect is being accentuated. So this is based on measurements taken over the last, I guess it would be 35 years now. We've got the warm colors mean warming, cool colors mean cooling, and you can see, broadly speaking, in the troposphere, it's warming. And interestingly, where it's warming the most is sort of situated over industrial centers. In the stratosphere, broadly speaking, it's all cooling, which is indicative of an enhanced greenhouse effect. Okay. So we'll return to the Arctic and look at our field site. Where I showed you those logs with the muskox print was just here on this river terrace, and there's just wood sort of scattered all around in front of this glacier. This glacier is retreating, as are most glaciers on our planet. How can we tell it's retreating? Well, there's a big mound of rubble down here, where during the last ice age, the glacier had advanced enough, pushed all that material in front of it, left it there, and has since started melting back that way. It's also retreating because it's thinning, and I've got another picture coming up that shows it a bit better. But you can see that lighter color just around the bend there, and then it's got the darker color above it. That's known as a trim line. That lighter color is just recently exposed material. The darker stuff is material that's broken down, been weathered, has plants growing on it, has a darker color. So this is just a time lapse showing two aerial photos, just to continue with proof that this thing is actually retreating. You can see in 1960, the end of the glacier was down here, and if you use that valley right here as a reference, right there as a reference, you can see that the end of the glacier has retreated back that much in the intervening 50 years. This is the trim line I was talking about. So you can see it's greatly enhanced from 1960, showing that the glacier's thinning. And I want to draw your attention to these features here. Okay, what these are, they're stream channels along the side of the glacier. So this is where meltwater, as snow and ice melts, it flows off the side of the glacier and flows as a stream along the side. Now what this shows is that at some point, the glacier was all the way up here, and that uppermost stream channel represented the stream channel that was in contact with the ice at the time. And as the glacier thins, it makes a new stream channel and a new stream channel, and is working on a new stream channel today. This is a picture of these stream channels from the ground. This is to say that at one time in the recent past, the glacier was up this high up the valley wall, and it has since thinned progressively down here. Now, why is this at all important? Well, it's important because the glacier has done the dirty work for us when we're trying to find the source of this wood so that we can investigate it fully. You walk up these stream channels, come up against this face right here with a bunch of wood sticking up out of it. So me and my friends were walking up, and the wood was getting more and more common. We knew we were getting close, and then we came around the corner, and there it was, with outcroppings sticking out of this face. If you take a closer look, there are leaves here, and they're just like leaves we find outside today. They're not fossils, they're not rock, they're actual leaves. Here you have sort of these accumulations of wood, like you would on a river today, on a riverbank after a flood. Get back to the lab and you start looking through the soil, and you nuts, birch bark, seeds, even insect casing, all indicative of something very different during the time that this sediment was laid down than exists there presently. Alder seed here. We got excited about this one because it looked like it might have been eaten, and so we were like, wow, maybe we can find an animal that could give us a better idea of what was going on, or when we're looking at in history. We didn't. Birch bark again. Five-needle pine. This is an extinct species of pine. And a large cone. Bearberry leaves. This one was interesting because there's actually a bit of chlorophyll in there. We're able to do deeper for that. Alder leaf, we never found any alder wood, but tiny remnant of an alder leaf. So again, showing that it's a very different environment than is there presently. If you get a bit more esoteric about things, you can start chemically looking at soil samples, start looking for degradation products of lignin, and that's what these are. If you look at the ratio between cinnamonyl and vanilla monomers, and syringyl and vinyl monomers, you can get an idea of the composition of the forest based on the fingerprint of the lignin that's been left behind. And if you do that analysis, it turns out that this soil sample sits right in what you'd find in a modern-day mixed pine forest. So we could go out and take a sample. They would fall within this box. So does this Arctic sample. There's no pine up there now, of course. You could look at the lignin-phenol vegetation index, pretty much the same sort of thing. It puts it right in the middle of a pine forest as well. You can start looking at the structure of the carbon in your sample, and you can see a lot of it's aromatic, and this has some pretty good consequences for how this stuff might behave in the future, which we'll get into in a minute. This stuff doesn't degrade very well, so it would be considered a very low-quality nutrient. But there are carbohydrates, lots of them, and aliphatic. I mean, waxes potentially, but they're aliphatic, which means they're not all sort of closed off and difficult to degrade like aromatics are. This would be considered candy to anything that's looking to degrade carbon in this environment. This is easily metabolized substrate. So, take an inventory of what we've seen. In wood identification, we've got birch, larch, spruce, and pine, upwards of 87 years old. With leaves, we've got bearberry, Labrador tea, lots of it, alder, pine, spruce, and larch. Insect identification, which is exceedingly difficult. I don't do it, but I've been told it's exceedingly difficult. We can definitely come up with 2 species of beetles, but at least 6 others are in there. Can't really identify which ones they are. And then we got a palynologist to look at things and confirmed what we found in the wood and the leaves, but also there's some hemlock nearby and some heath. All in all, it tells us we've got a mixed boreal forest with plenty of water available, which is in stark contrast to what's there now in the polar desert. So a very different climate in the past when this was deposited. It went from something that looks something like this to what there is today. But when did it do so? Okay, and this is sort of the main stop in the research right now. We can constrain it very broadly within about 2.5 million years. We know that it can't be any younger than 2.5 million years because, as you might recall from a graph earlier, that's when the ice age was there. Okay, things cooled, we had glaciers, we had ice sheets over this region. We couldn't really have trees growing there. We don't think it's any older than 5 million years because there was a tree species in the Arctic that is present in a lot of the other sites called Metasequoia. Its closest living relative is Dawn redwood right now. It was very prolific in the pollen that it produced, and it was distributed broadly. We don't see anything like that in our sample. So we think that there wasn't any Metasequoia around. When they disappeared from this region was about 5 million years ago. So we're looking at being between 2.5 and 5 million years. While it would be really nice to come up with a more concise date, radiocarbon doesn't work, this stuff's too old. There's a bunch of other techniques we could use, but we didn't really sample properly when we were up there because we didn't really know we'd have to. That's another thing we're trying to pitch to funding agencies and everything else. So we think we're in this region, which would fall in the Pliocene, which has attracted a lot of scientific interest lately because the Pliocene was the last time in Earth's history where atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were similar to what we see today, and global temperatures were 3 to 5 degrees warmer than what we see today, which is what they're forecasting for the next century, well, 50 years to century. Okay? So if we're looking for an idea of what the world might look like in the next century, we only have to look back between 2.5 and 5 million years to get an idea. Now, did anyone catch this in May 2013? Where for the first time ever, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels topped 400 parts per million. That means if you take an air sample and you analyze 1 million particles in there, 400 of them are going to be carbon dioxide. Now, you might not have seen it because Angelina Jolie was in the news that week, so this was there for about a day, and then it disappeared. This was just an isolated observation. This has now been passed, and that's the atmospheric concentration, 400 and a bit over by now. But this is Pliocene. These are Pliocene conditions. So, in the Pliocene, we had a forested Arctic. Temperature was 3 to 5 degrees warmer than today. What does that mean for the Earth moving forward? Now, this is again taken from the IPCC reports, where they do a bunch of modeling in the future. So this is obviously, we've got records of what temperature was doing that, global surface warming, years here. And then they run a bazillion models to try to forecast what the world's going to look like under different conditions. So you can see if we have high economic growth, a lot of fossil fuel burning, okay, our surface warming will rise. Why? Because we put more greenhouse gases in. This is the greenhouse effect. If we have moderate growth under a scenario with a bit less, low growth, and then if we just stop what we're doing right now and just keep it constant, that's where we'll be. And then you can use that data to start plotting on what our planet's going to look like. So this is a forecast in the next century. This is sort of your moderate, or that's your low growth, moderate growth, high growth. Warming on the legend here means warming on the planet. The thing to take away from this as an Arctic scientist is that polar regions, particularly the Arctic, warm more than everyone else. So while global temperatures may rise 3 to 5 degrees, in the Arctic you're looking at 7 to 12 degrees Celsius. So all of a sudden, having forests in the Arctic with just a 3-degree global change becomes feasible. Now, why does this happen? There's a lot of feedbacks in the Arctic that keep it cool. One of them would be albedo. Albedo is just the ratio between incoming solar radiation and what gets reflected back by light surfaces. If you had to squint when we had the recent snowfall, that's albedo. It's a light surface that's reflecting sunlight back up at you. If you start melting snow, melting ice, melting sea ice, the albedo of polar regions decreases and you start absorbing much more solar radiation. As an increase in temperature, it's going to increase more just because you've broken down those feedbacks. So polar regions warm more than other regions on the planet. So the last time global CO2 was 400 ppm, like we have today, we had a forested Arctic. What does that mean for animals that currently live up there? Okay, we've got, these are just examples of some of the charismatic megafauna that you see up there. All of them supremely adapted to life in a white world with short summers. The fox up there turns totally white at night. Wintertime, of course, relies on birds that lay their eggs on the ground to get it through the summer and the winter. Arctic wolf, of course, white. You can't imagine him blending in too well into the forest. So the Arctic hare, these guys are white, of course, but also adapted to a non-treed environment. If you try to walk up to them, they'll actually get up on their hind legs and run, like you and I would run. And the reason why is because they can see everything they need to see by getting up. It's only when you get really close that they'll run like a rabbit that you see here. And then, of course, muskox, okay, supremely adapted to ice, a cold, cryospheric world. Of course, I mean, you shave this guy down, it's probably the size of a house cat. But tons of fur, thick hooves for breaking up ice. If it warms much, they're going to be in dire straits. But more importantly, perhaps, is how will a warmer Arctic feed into the global climate system? And so this gets into what we went up there originally to look at, was to whether or not the high Arctic was actually emitting carbon dioxide or taking in atmospheric carbon dioxide. Up to this point, research from Alaska suggested that as the Arctic warms in Alaska, organic carbon in the soils gets released. The microbes, because of the warming temperatures, become more active. Liquid water is more available. So you start breaking down this organic matter and producing carbon dioxide at an increased rate. If there's a lot of water and you don't have a lot of oxygen, then you're producing methane at an increased rate. So we went up to the high Arctic to see if this relationship held true. And so up here, you've got permafrost soils, which just means that the soil is permanently frozen within a meter of the surface. So in the wintertime, the whole soil column is frozen solid. In the summertime, you start getting surface warming, and you get the development of an active layer, which is just this area that thaws. But it usually doesn't go much below a meter. Okay? Organic matter gets broken down very slowly in these regions because it's cold. In an Arctic tundra, in a polar desert, it's very dry. So there's not a lot of breakdown of organic matter. So summertime, you might get a moderate carbon dioxide flux coming up just because it's still cold and your active layer is in fact thicker. But if you thicken the active layer, you've just got that much more material to work with to break down these soil microbes. They're liking it a lot more because it's warmer, and so you might get a higher CO2 flux to the atmosphere. And this is important because Arctic soil have a whole bunch of organic matter in it. A whole bunch. Why? Because it doesn't get broken down. It's so cold that anything, all these plants, when they die, they just get incorporated in the soil column. They don't really get broken down that quickly. So we're looking at something in the order of 55.1 kilograms of soil organic carbon per meter squared. Just as a comparison, a cultivated soil in Ohio is only about 5.5 kilograms. So there's a lot of organic carbon up there to be oxidized, turned into CO2, contribute to the greenhouse effect, and add to that feedback. That's what the worry was. This becomes even more important when you think that, well, it's got buried forests under there with wood that's mummified. That's a lot of organic matter with the potential to be degraded. A publication came out in 2007 where they drilled an ice core to the bottom of the Greenland ice sheet, and they did a DNA examination of the DNA in the bottom of that ice core. And it turned out that it was a boreal forest under there before the Greenland ice sheet came over it. So there's all that organic matter underneath the Greenland ice sheet. Okay? So there's a lot of organic matter in polar regions. So we went up there to measure it. This is what we used. It's an eddy covariant flux tower. All it measures, well, no, not sure. What it measures is it measures CO2 in a parcel of air. It also measures soil temperature, wind direction, humidity, incoming solar radiation, photosynthetically active radiation, all kinds of things, to get an idea of what the flux is. Which is a fancy way of saying, is CO2 coming from the tundra to the atmosphere, so a source of greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, or is it absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so removing CO2 from the atmosphere? Now this was no end to worry, because the muskox saw it as a threat, and of course it stands up above the horizon, so it attracted them like bees. The rabbits, originally these solar panels were on the ground, and they would come and poop all over them. The wolves would actually, just like dogs here, they peed on our flux tower. And then the foxes, anything we tried to bury or any wire that was exposed, they'd pull it onto the ground and eat the wire. I don't know. So it was very stressful, but we managed to get some data out of it. So again, this is what we were measuring, whether we're removing CO2 from the atmosphere by photosynthesis, that's what this is, or are we releasing CO2 to the atmosphere by soil respiration, which is those microbes eating organic matter, sending CO2 to the atmosphere. So we were there in the summer of 2008, which was a long time ago. This project has kept going. Trends are still happening. So we were there in July, basically to set it up and, as it turned out, chase animals away. How you can interpret this graph, this is day of year, so this is basically July. And then we've got the flux. Okay? A negative flux means that it's drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. Positive flux means that it's a source of CO2 and putting CO2 up the atmosphere. So negative flux, photosynthesis is winning. Positive flux, soil respiration is winning. And you can see that generally speaking, it's a sink. So generally speaking, it's removing CO2 from the atmosphere, albeit as a tiny, tiny amount, but still a sink. It's not a source like they feared was happening in Alaska. But was this representative of the entire year? Specifically, when the snowpack melted, was there any production of CO2 over winter that gets trapped under the snowpack and then burped out as it melts? So we had to go back there, and you might ask, why not just leave the flux tower up over winter? We couldn't do that because temperatures were too cold, which I'll show in the next graph. So we just had to go up there early the next season and try to set it up in the snow. The reason why we couldn't leave it there over winter is because our data logger, which was the most important piece of equipment on that tower, had this digital screen that would crack at minus 30 degrees. So you can see there's a substantial part of the winter where, the thing wouldn't have worked. So we went back, and again, got there early. We were up there in May, and snow didn't really melt until the end of June. Very excited to see the results. Really wanted to see what happened at snow melt. And that's what this gap is here, where we have no data. The reason why, okay, so you can see this is the snow melting. This is soil temperature in green. You can see that under the soil, over the course of the season, it gets towards 15 degrees Celsius. So that's really warm. That's less than a meter down, of course. The purple here is soil moisture. So this is the snowpack melting. Beautiful. It would be really nice to know what happened there. The reason why was because there was a little diode that ran from the solar panel to the station. That as things warmed, all the wires sort of relaxed and cracked that diode, and so we couldn't charge the station from there to when we got up there to monitor things there. Little diode. I could make one for $0.25. Like I just Really disappointing. But the neat thing about it was we see in the winter there's not much happening. This little burp here is actually just an artifact of the sensor itself warming up. So basically it hovers around zero. But we still see this when we come back and the snow's all gone. We see this trend of it being a sink, although be a very small one, that slowly decreases towards the end of the season when leaves start to die and autumn ensues. So it's reproducible between years pretty well. So we're confident that this was happening at this point. We went back and it keeps happening. So the tundra in this region is a sink for CO2, which was amazing to us. It was sort of flew in the face of what they found in Alaska. So there was hope. Why was it a sink? Well, if you plot photosynthetically active radiation against that CO2 flux, you can see that they're inversely related. So when we have a lot of photosynthesis, you get a decrease in the flux. Basically, that's just photosynthesis. So when there's photosynthesis, it's drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, the neat thing about it is that these latitudes, in the summertime, you have 24 hours of sunlight. So the tundra, right now, in this region, all summer long, is a consistent sink for atmospheric CO2, which is good news if you're not a big fan of global warming. We were part of a network, so we were up here. We had sort of a latitudinal gradient doing the same measurements that we were doing. And what you see is that as long as your sun doesn't set, you're consistently a draw for atmospheric CO2. As soon as the sun sets in these more southerly stages, suddenly soil respiration takes over and you become a source. So as long as the sun's out, you're drawing down. This is just results from a flux chamber, so basically we turn off the lights, see what happens. Sure enough, you turn off the lights and you actually do start producing CO2 associated with plants. So we think this is some sort of mycorrhizal thing where we've got microbes degrading organic carbon around plant roots. So currently the Arctic is a sink for CO2, but the Arctic is warming. We have evidence that in the past, conditions that are similar today, we had a forested Arctic. Those conditions are forecast for the next 100 years. What's going to happen in the Arctic in the future? Will it continue to function as a sink? Remember, a forest. We're putting more plants there, more roots there. Are we going to maintain that photosynthesis overpowering that soil respiration? Or is this sink going to increase with increased leaf area? Put more plants there, more leaves, more photosynthesis going on. And we're seeing this greening of the Arctic happening already. This is a poor diagram. I realize it's a bit different, but if you squint, you can see we've got a purple area fringing the southern Arctic, and then it pops up here as well. What that means is the trend in photosynthetic activity as monitored from satellites, but also this NDVI, which I had to write down what that was, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's basically a proxy for leaf area, a proxy for photosynthesis that's actually happening. So when you see purple here, that means that we've got more photosynthesis. We've got more plant life, more photosynthesis happening. And you can see it's tree line, shrub line, grass line starting to march north. So we're seeing the reforestation of the Arctic already. So what does this mean? I think this is the outstanding question. Will the Arctic warming increase soil respiration, so start breaking down those stores of organic matter, or will bringing more leaves up there increase photosynthesis, so it remains the dominant process? And I'll leave that. Thank you very much.
Bill can take questions if anybody has them.
Yes.
How do you predict these temperatures in the past?
The past temperatures?
Yeah.
That's a good question. You can look at the oxygen isotopes, and that's a direct measurement of temperature. So I'll get back to this graph. There we go. So you see on the y-axis in the middle graph there, we've got that funny symbol with the 18O. That's the ratio of oxygen isotopes. And as an air mass or water cools, it preferentially drops the heavy isotope and the light isotope gets transported out. So you can actually use that ratio as a thermometer. It's Rayleigh distillation effect. So you have a good idea of what the temperature was if you can get those oxygen-18 ratios. The rest are all sort of proxy data using known carbon dioxide concentrations and then monitoring their forcing on climate and getting at a temperature. Yes?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Getting that from core samples? What's your sample?
Oh, these aren't mine, I should point out. These are from ocean, foraminifera, so shelled organisms that will take up those oxygen isotopes when they build their shells. So you can date them, and then you can see what temperature they lived in. Yeah. Yeah.
The wood that you're finding just topping out on the surface of the formations there as the glacier retreats. Once that wood is exposed, does it deteriorate rapidly? Or in that climate, does it not?
That's a good question. And, I mean, it does deteriorate, not as rapidly as here because it's so cold and dry. But as things warm and get moisture up there from permafrost melt and warming air temperatures, you'd expect this stuff to get degraded more quickly. And it's pretty yummy stuff for the soil microbes that would be doing the work because you've got your carbohydrates and things like that. Yes?
You see that these results are different than what was obtained in Alaska?
The flux data, yeah.
So why would they do that?
Because it's a different system. So in Alaska, it's a lot more vegetated and the soil tends to be a lot wetter. So it's a less desert-like climate, just a different climate. And so things are warmer, so the microbes are happier. You've got water, so the microbes are happier. And if you have the organic matter for them to work on, which you do, you start getting a higher flux rate. Whereas up here, it's drier and colder. The microbes are having to work a lot harder to do what they do.
But maybe a second question, but you ended your talk by saying, at least for now, we're seeing that.
Yep.
But that could change. I mean, it could change if the temperature rises or if the depth of the soil.
Yep.
If that becomes warm, you might have inflection between something else.
You're absolutely right. And yeah, and so that was what I consider to be the outstanding question is, with change, if you put a forest up there, more roots, more mycorrhizal communities, higher temperatures, you've got water, will photosynthesis be able to outcompete soil respiration in the net balance? And that's, we don't know.
The program, this is kind of the second last of the series, and the next program will resume in January with 2 programs in the planetarium at Ohio State. There are flyers over there. This is actually the 5th in the series of programs, and then we'll have a number of programs for youth in the spring that will involve 4-H. So thank you for joining us this evening. And I think Mark has an announcement to make too.
If I may, just for a minute. Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Miller. I'm the Education Manager here at Franklin Park Conservatory. For those of you who need to get on the road, you can exit straight out this way, make a right, and it'll go right to the parking lot. But if you have time and you're interested, we're offering a tour of our biomes that will focus on the effect of climate change on plants and the reverse, how plants affect climate change. So if you're interested in that tour, just follow along with us back to the visitor center where we'll gather and we'll start that tour. That tour will be about 45 minutes. To go on that tour, we do ask that you pay admission to the conservatory. And another thing, tonight is the first night of our holiday season and we'll be open until 10. So you could also stay and look at all the lights, and our cafe, which has great food, will be open until 9 o'clock. So I'll leave that up to you. Thank you, and thank you to Byrd Polar Research for considering us as one of their venues. We're thrilled to have you here. It was a great talk. Thank you.